Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Aidan Randall from Fridays for Future Bruce Gray Owen Sound. And today I'm interviewing Lucy Sharratt of the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, also known as CBAN. Lucy works in Halifax as the coordinator of the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network, and I'm so glad she's able to join us today for this virtual climate check. We're going to talk about GMOs and industrial agriculture and how that impacts our health and the environment. Industrial agriculture is said to be responsible for about 50% of all global emissions. And when we think about that, it includes deforestation, land use, soil depletion, and also the fossil fuel use and use of herbicides, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers. GMOs are also a part of the problem, and we'll talk about that more later during the interview. If you don't know what GMOs are, I'll give a brief overview. GMOs are mainly crops that are genetically engineered in a lab to produce specific traits, mainly to create crops that they're resistant to Roundup or other herbicides. And that includes corn, soybeans, sugar beets, and canola. That means that the farmer can plant the crop in his field, her field, and when they spray it to kill the weeds, the corn or whatever will be left standing. Another form of genetic modification is to create an internal insecticide in corn so that the bugs that eat it get killed when they start to eat it. So again, Lucy Sharratt is the coordinator of the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network. She leads their work to coordinate actions on raising awareness about biotechnology and how we need to be more aware about what's in our food. There's many different ways that biotechnology is used, and we'll talk more about that later on. But I'm so glad that Lucy was able to join us. Please welcome Lucy Sharratt to our live stream.
Hi, Aidan.
Oh, hello, Lucy. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Great. Yeah, it's nice to meet you. Our virtual climate strike today is all about industrial agriculture and GMOs. And I'd like to start right away by getting off to a discussion about industrial agriculture. And as I mentioned, I heard that about 50% of all global emissions are caused by a food system, which is kind of unbelievable when I first heard about that. So how does industrial agriculture contribute to our climate crisis?
Yeah, the numbers are pretty shocking. There is debate over them, but the International Panel on Climate Change has done calculations that, as you had said in your introduction, include land use changes. And so, really, we have heard that, the food system is responsible for up to 37% of emissions. And this would include the clearing of forests, as you said, for making more room for agricultural crops, but also the transport of food. And as you also said, the use of petrochemical products in agriculture. So it's not just, the use of fossil fuels with driving a tractor, but the synthetic fertilizers and even the pesticides are products of petrochemicals. And actually, the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that's used is a very powerful greenhouse gas emitter. And so there's so many parts to our food system. Obviously, we all eat food. It's going to be a big part of our economy. And so it's going to use up a lot of energy. But the question is, what do we need to put into agriculture? And how do we manage what we get out of it? And this is the big discussion now with the food system that we have is how many resources are we putting in? And they're called inputs, these pesticides, fertilizers, and other equipment that are relied on for food production. And then when we get all that food, all of those calories, all of that energy, do we transport it across the world? Do we feed it to livestock? And do we waste a lot of it on the way? How can we manage it better as well at that end?
Yeah, I think that's right. I've heard a lot about, well, I've heard about how carbon is released from the soil and the way farming is done today, how they mine the soil and burn through the soil with the nitrogen fertilizer. And then as well, I find it unusual how many foods that could be grown here, but we just can't get them unless they're grown hundreds of miles away.
It's something that I think when we go to the grocery store, it's easy to see some of the very obvious problems or some of the very obvious solutions that are available to us. But it is, there's so many moving parts. It's a huge discussion.
Absolutely. Yes. I think we were also going to talk about GMOs and the truth about GMOs. There's a lot of different opinions about that, but how does it transform the way that we farming practices, and what are the health and environmental impacts of GMO crops?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question to look at GMOs, which are genetically modified organisms. We can call it genetic engineering or genetic modification. But when we look at this technology, how does it give us a perspective on industrial agriculture, on the climate crisis, and on biodiversity crisis? And so this technology that allows scientists in the lab to really directly change the genetic makeup of organisms outside of relying on reproduction and traditional breeding. It means that one thing that it means is that companies can patent those new genetic sequences. And now you have a new input in agriculture. Seed is always an input in agriculture, but now you have new ownership over that input. That seeds can now be intellectual property of large corporations. And through the history of genetic engineering, those large corporations are the same companies that are also selling the major pesticides, the major herbicides that are used on the big industrial crops. And so the investment of the technology of genetic engineering is also the investment that's made into pesticides, all into the major crops of corn, canola, soy, and cotton, these big crops that are grown on a lot of land. A lot of it is fed to livestock. It moves around the world. So it's a window into how a technology can facilitate corporate control and why that control matters. That we go to the grocery store and a lot of the products have the same ingredients, canola oil or corn ingredients. And there's money to be made from concentrating on those crops instead of, as you said, where are these other crops that could be grown here? And this is the question with the introduction of a new technology like genetic engineering also allows us to think about questions of democracy, like how we as a society can collectively make decisions about our future. How do we want our food to be produced? And what do we think about new technologies? And so I think it can be really helpful to think about genetic engineering in terms of its impacts and how it has helped concentrate interest in corn. For example, 40% of the research and development into goes into corn, it's because it's so profitable. But then also, in terms of solutions, is genetic engineering a solution to some of our problems, or do we have solutions that lie in other places? These issues of control are really important to think about for our collective problem solving.
Yes, that's right. I think the GMOs really it's really another level of kind of corporate control, like really taking seeds and doing what only I kind of think maybe what nature should just do, but kind of humans meddling too much. I'm not sure. But when I read about GMOs and that 70% of processed foods contain GMO ingredients. Is that still true?
Yeah, so that is an estimate because no one's really tracking where genetically modified foods are, certainly not in North America up until this point. In Canada, there is no labeling for genetically modified foods on the grocery store shelves. But because we know that, 80% or more of our corn is genetically engineered in North and South America, over 50% of our soy is now genetically engineered in Canada. A lot of the processed food ingredients are all the same ingredients: corn, canola, and soy. And so that's where we get this number of up to 70% of our processed food ingredients could have genetically modified ingredients. But in actual fact, it's only a few genetically engineered crops on the market, and only for a few traits. You've already mentioned those traits.
Yeah.
To be resistant to herbicides and to be toxic to insects. And it's corn, canola, and soy, and then white sugar beet, which is used for sugar processing, and a tiny bit of genetically engineered herbicide-tolerant alfalfa is now grown in Ontario and other provinces in the East. And then if you're grocery shopping, the only other two ingredients or fruits and vegetables you would find would be papaya from the US or some squash from the US, and now a genetically engineered salmon. So in fact, Canadians are the first people in the world to eat a genetically modified food animal, and we still don't have labeling. And so also when we think about industrial agriculture, we could also include industrial aquaculture, that now we're not just farming on the land, we're farming in the ocean, in these net pens. And salmon is a big species that is grown in those pens.
Yes, I didn't realize that they're grown in the ocean. Is that right?
So
but in pen.
Yeah, so the genetically modified salmon will be contained to on-land facilities.
Okay.
But the salmon that we eat at the moment, that's farmed salmon, is mostly grown in ocean net pens. The genetically modified salmon will now be grown in an on-land facility in Prince Edward Island and some in Indiana. So it's an experiment. But of course, we don't know where it is on the grocery store shelves. So, there's no choice for people unless you want to avoid farmed salmon. But it is, it raises similar questions around the inputs and then what we do with that, with the food that we get from that process.
Yes. Yeah, that was a lot of good questions and thoughts about the different crops. I think many people might not know about the different crops that are sold in Canada, because I once posted a thing on my Facebook page and someone asked, what are GMOs? I think we need to build a lot more awareness. And one of the ways I was thinking about doing tonight is to advocate for GMO labeling, which is, there's a petition going to the House of Commons. I signed it. And to all the viewers, if you can take a few minutes to sign this petition to the House of Commons, you can go to cban.ca/labeling, right? And try to get as many signatures as possible before July 4th. Is there anything you would like to add about that?
Well, it's a great action. It's been a long time that over 80% of Canadians agree that they want to see labeling of genetically engineered foods for all kinds of reasons. But certainly, if we're to have any say in what we're eating or how, or the awareness of this technology, how would Canadians know that what GMOs are if they're not even labeled in the grocery store shelves? So fundamental to democracy is the transparency and availability of information. And so if consumers have that information, then maybe we can have more to say about our food system.
Right. Yes. Well, we already require a lot of things to be labeled, so it's not much to add. But I think they're worried because people will be turned off by it, like they won't want to buy it. But what do you think is a good response to that? Like if we're told that, I read on the CBAN website you have some talking points, like how to respond to arguments against it. Some of those are good. You can go and look at that if you're watching. And what are some ways that we can get involved if we want to take action to help get this implemented?
Well, I think actually, there's a lot that everyone can do in their own lives to contribute to a food system that would have less of an impact, both on the climate and on biodiversity, that we need to have, a robust natural world that can also allow us to continue farming as well. And when we make food choices in the grocery stores, there's not only labeling that hopefully one day we will see labeling for genetically engineered products, but there are some ways that you can already make decisions when you walk into the grocery store to avoid genetically engineered products. There's a certification called the Non-GMO Project, but there's also organic farming, which prohibits genetic engineering, the use of those seeds and other products, but also organic farmers don't use synthetic pesticides and fertilizers and have a range of practices that are ecological practices that are designed to support ecological farming. And so, if we have a vision for what we want to see from our food system, there are a few choices we can make, even if we can only make a few of them every time we go grocery shopping. Some of those can really make a big difference. Like in Ontario, organic dairy can, that's a really important part of the whole farming sector. And, farmers work really hard to produce their products. And, I think it's difficult when we walk into the grocery store. It's quite overwhelming, but it is one concrete way that we can make a difference.
Yes. Well, our choices really, really matter. I think often often people might not know that organic foods are not GMO. So if it's organic, it's automatically non-GMO.
That's right. That's right.
And then and then if you mind, would you just tell us a little bit about your story, about how you became concerned about GMOs and how you started working for the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network?
Sure. Well, I was also a young student when I first was thinking about issues of power and control in the peace movement and justice movements. And really, it was those issues of how is it that companies can have so much control over decision making that led me into an interest into the technology of genetic engineering and working with environmental and social justice groups who are really looking at all kinds of different issues raised by genetic engineering, now under an understanding that what we're working for together is food sovereignty, that we're working for a localized food system where people have more control over the production of food, the consumption of food, and that what's amazing is that, yes, our food system is part of our democracy. It should be part of our democracy. And that is also a part of how we, solve the climate crisis, how we move together into a better vision together. And what's amazing about the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network is it is a very big and diverse community of groups. And so it involves farmer organizations and environmental groups and social justice groups and grassroots groups. So it's an inspiring community which tells us how different people can work together and really look at a complex issue and discuss what that issue means and how to get on top of it, how to think it through and try and come up with some solutions.
Yes. So if anyone wanted to find out more about CBAN, what would they do?
Yeah, the website cban.ca, and we have a range of, there's some basic information on the website, but also a list of issues raised by genetic engineering. And so somebody might find that one of those issues in particular is of more interest than others, because the technology has far-reaching implications, and it raises so many different environmental and social justice issues that are connected to other issues like the climate crisis. And so it may be that somebody finds that there's something there that is really important to them, or something that they can take action on that connects to genetic engineering at cban.ca.
Yes. Well, it's a great organization. I encourage everyone to check it out. And I have another question about climate change and GMOs, because often I think the agricultural industry tells us that GMOs are a solution to climate change, and maybe that as droughts become more frequent, they can engineer crops that are more drought resistant or produce higher yields. And I wondered what your response is to that.
Yeah, it's a really important question, because it's a very compelling argument, just like the argument that genetic engineering, these GMOs can feed the world. They can solve the climate crisis. They can solve any manner of problems that we have. And one major problem with this proposal for a solution is it relies on a technology, and it relies on a technology that's owned by companies. So, there's a lot of discussion about techno fixes, that, we have these complex social and political problems, and the solutions are too difficult. We know this with the climate crisis. The actual solutions are really difficult. They take a lot of political will. We'll really have to change a lot of things. It's a lot easier to talk about, well, we could just have some new seeds and that would solve the problem. One of the major issues is somebody owns that seed. A company owns the solution. If we decide that a techno fix is the fix we want, somebody owns that technology. We will buy that solution. We won't own that solution collectively. And that is a major obstacle to thinking, okay, if we want this future, what does it look like if we rely on technology to provide us with those solutions? And that's outside of the question, well, do those solutions even exist? Do we have those technologies? Does genetic engineering actually deliver? And then how does that compare to the solutions we already have access to, the seeds and the animal breeds that farmers around the world already have? There's a tremendous amount of biodiversity in the farm, agro-biodiversity. And this is something that our entire food system is based on. It's just that the industrial farm food system has really concentrated on a few crops, and it's concentrated on a model that is about synthetic inputs. So what else already exists out there that actually is very powerful, very quick, very nimble, and is owned collectively, and would be far more resilient into the future than a technology that may or may not work and that we know is owned by somebody who wants to make money.
Yes. Yeah, that when we get into the profit of corporations, it can really ruin what we're trying to accomplish, I think. And kind of like there's green energy companies as well that are trying to profit from that. rather than really dealing with the climate crisis. And what do you think about I have a few questions from the community.
Great.
And one of them was, I'll just look at it. It said, is our federal government currently subsidizing industrial agriculture more than privately held family farms?
That's a really good question, because there's all kinds of different ways that the federal government either directly or indirectly funds different types of research or different types of companies and businesses. And there's a lot of money in research that does not go to organic farming, for example. And the government used to invest in extension services for farmers that don't exist anymore, which provided advice to farmers and worked with farmers. Now farmers rely on companies that sell products for some of that advice. And the government also used to invest in public plant breeding, often with farmers. And now instead, we're relying on private companies or institutions. And so there's a lot that could be done with government funds that's not being done. There's a huge opportunity to invest in agroecology, to invest in ecological farming and ecological farmers, because it's about skills. Often the investment in organic agriculture or ecological agriculture was about skills over products, and it's the products that make money. So this is the tension that we see. So there's a lot of room for really good change where the government could invest in ecological farming.
Right. Yeah, the government needs to lead us. I think that the coronavirus has shown as well that when the government can step in and really lead the public in what's right. So like social distancing, maybe people didn't want to do that, but they listened to what the government was telling them. So
yeah, there can be big decisions made, and they can be made quickly if there's a need, and it's all a matter of political will. Yeah.
Yes, but we can help create the political will.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Yes, and then one more question from one of the community. They were asking, like, should we put our energies into just transitioning from non-GMO crops from GMO crops to non-GMO crops within the same industrial agricultural system, or think about going away from those crops to a whole different type of agriculture?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And yeah, absolutely. The issue is beyond the use of this technology. It's about the entire system. And the National Farmers Union has looked at the climate crisis and said that it looks a lot like the farm crisis, that farmers are spending a lot of money on these farm inputs like pesticides and fertilizers. And one of the ways out of the climate crisis and the farm crisis at the same time is low input agriculture. So in fact, the entire system can be at least shifted, if not transformed. But one of the things we see with the pandemic, as we experience it in Canada, is a lot of discussion about the future of our food system and the need for us to have a resilient food system that is more localized. So there's a lot of opportunity now with an attention on the climate crisis and the acknowledgement that, as you said in your introduction, that the food system is contributing so much to greenhouse gas emissions that, in fact, a lot of the solutions in the food system that transition us out of the current model that includes like all of these inputs and imports and exports, which, you know, a lot of farmers depend on those markets. But there's a lot of inputs that, you know, farmers are losing all their income to buy these inputs, and that there are solutions that would benefit both farmers and the climate.
Yes, that's right. I think we need to think about new ways of agriculture. I think I'm hearing a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture. Is that what you were talking about when you said ecological agriculture?
Regenerative agriculture is one way to talk about ecological agriculture that has a very sort of specific focus on the soil and regenerating the soil. But there's a lot more that can happen in agriculture, but that is definitely, one effort and one really important part of transforming agriculture or improving how agriculture is done for the climate is, improving soil health to sequester carbon in the soil, that it's a resource that we have, that the plants need, but that also the climate needs as well.
Yes, and that means that it's kind of like a natural form of carbon storage. I know they talked about mechanical carbon storage, but this is a better way, like just like how trees absorb carbon.
Yeah, so like we said, with new technologies, you could decide there's a technology that could fix that problem, or maybe there's already something else available to us that can be the solution.
Yes. Yeah, well, I find that they're always holding out a new technology as the solution, but for thousands of years, people were farmed sustainably. So I think we can go back. We don't need to invest in technologies that are patented and owned by corporations.
Yeah, there's a lot to be learned from the past. We are moving forward, and there's a lot more people on the planet. We are consuming more food, but in reality, small farmers are still the ones who are feeding the world. 70% of the food that we eat globally is produced by small farmers who use far less resources than industrial agriculture.
Yes. And could you just, I noticed at the beginning you said about how much food is wasted, and I know a lot of grocery stores and food supply chains probably throw out a lot of the food that goes through, and I wondered if that's another benefit of localized food systems that cuts down waste.
Yeah, absolutely. There's at every stage in the food system, food wastage can occur, like after harvest, or even, I suppose, during harvest, and and then in transport, and then in the grocery store during storage. Like, especially if food goes a long way, there's all kinds of opportunities for food wastage, and the numbers are huge. And it's sort of 1/3 of the food that's produced gets squandered, wasted, not only in sort of these processes, but also in overconsumption as well. That was part of the calculation.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Can you just repeat that again? 1/3.
Yeah, it's at least 1/3 of our food. Yeah, so there's these inputs into agriculture, and then the beautiful output is squandered. And a lot of that is also in the household, but it's the whole process. So if the process is closer to home, then there's opportunity to save some of that energy that otherwise gets lost.
Yes, I think everything we need to go back to more local economies, like food economies, and producing what we need in Canada rather than shipping things from abroad. Was there any other comments you would like to address to the audience about GMOs or industrial agriculture?
Yeah, maybe just to say that any transition can be very hard, and there's a lot of farmers who are very worried about discussions about transformation and transition to something new when they're already working so hard to produce food in the existing system, and they rely on how food is produced now and how food is bought and sold. And so this is why it's important when we talk about a transition that we're always talking about a just transition, and providing people with the resources that they need to be a part of that future, and recognizing that it can be very difficult for people whose livelihood is in the middle of this whole system that is unsustainable and has to change. But that's where solidarity matters, and that's why food sovereignty is a vision of solidarity, where together we can create that future.
Yes, and a just transition is always important. We keep that in mind at Fridays for the Future as well, about all workers who are affected by a sustainable transition need to receive the help that they need to find new jobs in the new economy. And I just was going to ask another question as well about what are the health impacts. We talked a lot about the environment, but there's health impacts of using pesticides and also GMOs. Could you just list a few of them, or what might be health impacts?
Yeah, because that is the big question that's unanswered, because with genetically engineered foods, we don't know what the health impacts are. They could be safe to eat. The Canadian government says that the genetically engineered foods on the market are safe to eat. They've been approved, but they've been assessed in a process that happens behind closed doors. It relies on company information, and there's very little independent science that's done. So we don't know, and we can't say that there are health impacts from eating GMOs, but we do know that these pesticides that are used in the growing of that food, those pesticides are toxins. That's why they're regulated. That's why they have labels that have instructions on them. They are designed to kill plants and pests, insect pests. And the quantity of pesticides that we're using in food production is substantial. And we know that herbicide sales have increased by 243% since 1994. So it's roughly from the introduction of genetically engineered crops.
Wow.
That's the amount of pesticides that's increased, or the sales in herbicides. So the system that genetically engineered crops are part of has only doubled down on pesticide use. And this is part of why we need to break it open to begin a transition to something else, is because we are just contaminating soils and waterways more. And we're also exposing ourselves to that health risk through those pesticide residues as well.
Yes. And could you just mention a little bit about desiccation? That's another thing that's people are talking about, how it's having an impact on health as well, possibly. So
yeah, I mean, I can't comment on it specifically, except to say that that herbicides are used at different stages in crop production, and sometimes there are synthetic chemicals used after or before harvest, and so there's more of a chance that the residues will be in our food system, depending on how and when the herbicides are used. And so it's part of this whole question of how dependent are we on synthetic chemicals in food production? And some of these examples are more worrisome than others. And how do we move away from it? How can we provide resources so that we can farm without those synthetic chemicals? We know that more and more corn and soy expands, and more pesticides are used on that corn and soy. And that corn and soy is now largely genetically engineered. It's herbicide tolerant. And one, example of the impact is, in the US Midwest, the corn and soy has taken over the wild areas of just, a bit of weeds here and there, milkweeds for monarch butterflies. And so over the past 20 years, the 90% reduction in monarch butterfly populations is down to habitat destruction. And a lot of that is, certainly in the US, which is part of their migratory route, is down to the expansion of corn and soy, which is genetically engineered, which is, herbicides are used on that corn and soy, and the milkweed is destroyed. So the connection there between how we farm, biodiversity, and the resilience of our biodiversity to withstand some of the challenges of climate change. These are all interconnected.
Yes. Yeah, it's more than just global warming, isn't it? It's like there's that, but then there's biodiversity, loss of habitat, and you mentioned that butterflies and bees as well are declining as a result. Is that right? And other pollinators?
Yeah, that's, again, I wouldn't be able to comment specifically, but we know there's a trend of insect decline, and then there's specific questions that have been raised about the colony collapse and decline of pollinators, and what's the relationship between that, which is so important, and the use of pesticides, in particular the neonicotinoid pesticides that are coating the seeds, that there's different ways that we incorporate synthetic chemicals into our food production. And each one of these is different and can have a different type of impact on the soil, on pollinators, and then on users, farmers who are using synthetic chemicals, and then also on on consumers potentially.
Right. Well, that was an interesting discussion. I think we've decided to keep it around half an hour. I think if there's any other comments just about how we can, if we want to do our own choices, we can buy organic or look with a non-GMO project label. But is there any other things we can do, like talking to local government officials, or if we want to demand GMO labeling as youth activists?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have access to, well, your member of parliament, if you want to tell them about the petition for mandatory labeling and that you want to see labels for genetically engineered foods on the shelves. And you can also, in your own community, maybe there's a farmer's market, or maybe at the local shop, you can find local produce, and even talk to those farmers and ask them what kind of change do they want to see. Obviously, they want you to buy their products so they can keep making money and survive and keep farming ecologically. But also, is there government change that would also support them more? And that's a good way to also, be a part of not just choosing an ecologically farmed product, but also being a part of a movement to make sure that keeps happening and to add on to that momentum and build more ecological farming.
Yes. Yeah, I think we should do that more, and I'll talk to the other people in the community about how we can get more involved with local farmers. Well, thank you for joining us again. It was great to have you share your thoughts about GMOs and your experience. I think we'll just say goodbye now to everyone who's watching, and then I'll do a conclusion afterward. But thank you again for joining us, and remember to sign the petition. So it's cban.ca/labeling.
Great.
And if you want to find out more, go to cban.ca.
Great.
So thank you,
so much.
Lucy.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you, everyone. So that was a great interview we had. And thank you again for watching a virtual climate strike. This is Bruce Gray on Sound Fridays for Future. I'm Aidan Randall. And remember, if we get as many signatures as possible, we're putting more pressure to implement GMO labeling in Canada. We can talk to our MPs. We can talk to our community members. And I'd just like to reflect again about industrial agriculture and how it is such a huge problem, and there's many solutions. But we need to think about it more, because we often think about climate change. I was just talking to someone the other day about how often people think climate change is the smoke coming out of a power plant, but it's more than just that. It's a food system. It's maybe animal agriculture. It's maybe a lifestyle, so, and a consumer choices. So again, things that you can do: you can buy organic, you can support local farmers, go to the local farmers market, or buy directly from a farmer. That's a good way as well. And then you can know where your food is grown. Also, grow your own garden. That's a great way that you're producing the food yourself. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll do more talks about like this. I do them every week at 7 p.m. and later on I think we'll do one about regenerative agriculture in the future. So stay tuned for what we're going to do next week, and see you soon.